We're going to talk about parallel and perpendicular lines. So we have parallel lines and perpendicular lines, and how that relates to the slope y equals mx plus b. M is the slope, and parallel and perpendicular lines relate to each other depending on their slope, and b, which is their y-intercept. So first of all, let's think about parallel lines. Now, you've learned about these in the past. Basic definition is two straight lines in a plane that do not intersect at any point. So here are two picture examples of parallel lines, and you have studied those in the past, just what they are. And here's some pictures. Here's the lines in the middle of the road. There are lines on a football field. Railroad tracks is a common example of parallel lines, and some power lines have parallel lines in them as well. But when it comes to parallel lines and our equations of lines, parallel lines have the same slope, identical slopes, but different y-intercepts. So you can see right here in this first example, the number in front of the x is our slope, and it's the same, the number 2. Their y-intercepts are different. In the next example, the slopes are the same, 1/3, but the y-intercepts are different. And lastly, see that the slope, the number in front of x, is a 5, so they both have a slope of 5, but they have a different y-intercept. So parallel lines have the same slope, exactly the same. Let me give you another example that I just make up. So if I have 1/4 x plus 2, there's my slope, 1/4. So my other line must also have a slope of 1/4, and then just any other number besides 2 for the y-intercept. Now let's look at perpendicular lines. They're two straight lines in a plane that intersect at a 90-degree angle. So here's an example of a parallel line, and here's an example of a perpendicular, Here's two examples of perpendicular lines. They cross, and they make a right angle where they cross. On this sign here, warning the driver that there's an upcoming intersection, those two lines on that sign are perpendicular. There are a lot of things in construction that make perpendicular lines. It's called squaring. So on stairs, we would like to have them square or at a 90-degree angle. So those two lines are at perpendicular. In this window, again, all these lines are perpendicular at each point. And that's very important in construction, to make things perpendicular or squaring them up. And you'll see a lot of perpendicular lines, plus you'll see parallel lines in construction. In fact, in this picture here, we also have parallel lines. Those are parallel. And then the line that's running down through here is perpendicular to those two. So we see parallel and perpendicular lines in a lot of construction and a lot of those things. So now, how about the perpendicular lines? They have slopes, but they're not the same. They are opposite reciprocals. So first, let's review what opposites mean. Opposites. So opposites are like 2 and -2, 4 and -4. Okay, what are reciprocals? That is like 1/2, and if I flip it over, it becomes 2 over 1, or 2. And if I take 3/4 and I flip it over, I get 4/3. So not only are these slopes going to be opposites, they're also going to be reciprocals. They're going to be flipped over from each other. So that's what we're going to look at in our examples right here. To notice that they are opposites and they are also reciprocals. Okay, so here we have the number 1/2 for our slope. Well, if I take 1/2 and I flip it over, it becomes 2 over 1, or 2. And I also have to make it the opposite. So this slope was positive, so this slope will be negative. So -2 is the slope of the perpendicular line. 1/3. If I take 1/3 and I flip it over, it becomes 3 over 1, or 3. But my slope's going to have to be the opposite of 1/3. So the opposite of 1/3, positive 1/3, is negative. So it should be not 3, but -3. And then this last example, we have the slope of 2/3. So if I flip that over, I get 3 over 2. And this is again positive, so this has to be a -3 over 2. So if my slope was 2/5, the perpendicular slope, I would flip it over. And let's say it was -2/5. I would flip it over, and since that slope is negative, this slope would be positive. And that makes the lines perpendicular. So do not forget that M represents our slope and the B represents our y-intercept when we're looking at these. So what we want to do first when you're doing your assignment today is you're going to have a chart just like this on your assignment. And we want to say, are they parallel? Are they perpendicular? Or are they neither? So remember, if we were to graph these, which we'll look at a couple graphs in a moment, if they're parallel, they will never cross. And if they're perpendicular, they cross at a 90-degree angle. So what we need to look at is the slope. So remember, in y equals mx plus b, the number in front of the x is the slope. So in line 1, the slope is 4. In line 2, the slope is 4. They are the same. So these two lines are parallel. In the next one, this slope is -2. This slope is 2. They're not the same. They're opposites. But they have not been flipped. If I took -2 to make a whole number a fraction, I would put a 1 underneath. So if I was to flip that, it should be 1/2. So the slope should be, if it was perpendicular, it would be 1/2. If it was parallel, they'd be the same. Neither of those things are happening with that slope. This slope is 1/4, and this slope is -4. So if I take 1/4 and I flip it over, it becomes 4 over 1, or 4. And that one is, this is positive, and this is negative. So yes, it's flipped over, and they're different signs. So these two are perpendicular. This slope is 2/3. This slope is -3/2. So if I take 2/3, that's not letting me write it down that low, so let's erase some of this off of here so I can show you this. So if I have a slope of 2/3 and I flip it over, it becomes 3/2. So this slope is 2/3. This slope is -3/2, so it is flipped over, and they are opposites. So they have to be flipped over and opposites to be perpendicular. So in this next one, I'm going to have to erase some of my stuff because it is taking up some of my space. I'm looking at this next one where the slopes are 3/4 and 4/3. Well, if I flip 3/4 over, I get 4/3. But they're both positive. This is 3/4. This is 4/3, both positive. They're not the same, so they're not parallel, and they have not had their signs changed, even though they've been flipped over. They're reciprocals, but they also have to be opposite. So those are neither parallel or perpendicular. This slope is 1/3. This slope is 1/3. They're exactly the same, so these two lines are parallel. And lastly, this slope is 1/5, and this slope is -5. Well, if I flip 1/5 over, it will be 5/1 or 5. And this is a positive, this is a negative, so they're perpendicular. So when you look at your assignment, you're going to have a chart like this, and you're going to just figure out, are they parallel, are they perpendicular, or are they neither? Then you're going to have another chart, and you're asked to state the slopes. I do want to make a correction. You can mark yours out. This is a line 1, and we want the slope that's parallel to it and perpendicular. So the slope here, I'm going to write -7. The parallel slope will be exactly the same. The perpendicular slope, I have to take 7. Every whole number has a 1 underneath it, and I have to flip it over. 1/7. This is negative. This will be positive. The perpendicular slope is opposite and flipped. The parallel slope is the same. So the slope of the second line is -3. So the parallel slope is also -3. To write a whole number as a fraction, we put it over 1. And if I flip 3 over 1, I get 1/3. This one's negative. This one has to be positive. The next slope is 3/4. The parallel slope is going to be exactly the same, 3/4. The perpendicular slope, I have to flip it over. That is 4/3. This slope is positive, so this slope has to be negative. So remember, the parallel slope is exactly the same, and the perpendicular slope is the reciprocal and the opposite. So the slope of the next one is 3/2. So a parallel line would have a slope also of 3/2. Then if I take the 3/2 and I flip it over, I get 2/3. This slope is positive, so this has to be negative. The next slope is -1/5. So parallel slope is exactly the same. For the perpendicular slope, I flip it over, so that's 5/1 or 5. And since this is a negative, this slope will be +5. This slope is a 2. That means the parallel slope is also 2. To write a whole number as a fraction, I put a 1 underneath. If I flip over 2 over 1, it becomes 1/2. This slope is positive, so this slope has to be negative. And lastly, this slope is 8. So the parallel slope is also 8. To write any whole number as a fraction, I put a 1 underneath. To find the reciprocal, I flip it over and I make sure if that is positive, this one's negative. That's how you will do. You'll also have a chart where you will state the slope and you will write down the parallel slope, which should be exactly the same. and the perpendicular slope, which should be opposite reciprocals. Parallel is same, perpendicular is opposite reciprocal, which is flip the fraction over and then change its sign to 9. Okay. Then you're going to have a couple where you're going to graph them on the same graph. So I'm going to take the first one here, 1/4 x plus 2, and the second one is 1/4 x minus 5. So the first one here, in fact, I'm going to make them 2 different colors. The second line, I'm just writing it bigger so you know what I'm doing. So for the purple line, I will begin at 2. I rise 1 and run 4. That's my slope. Remember, this is my y-intercept, so I put that dot on the y-axis, and this is my slope. And from that point, I rise 1 and run 4. Should be going uphill, but I can do the same ratio going the other direction, down 1 and to the left 4. And then I can draw my line. How about for this line? This line I'm going to do in yellow, and it's going to go down here at -5. And again, same slope. Rise 1, run 4. I'm going to go the other direction, down 1 and to the left 4. I can draw my line through that, and you will see that these lines are never going to cross. They have the same slope. They're parallel. Then you're going to be asked to graph a set of perpendicular lines. So these are perpendicular because their slopes are reciprocals and opposites. Start with the purple. It begins at 4. Every whole number can be written with a 1 underneath. So we rise 2 and run 1. And then I can go the other direction in a ratio of down 2 and to the left 1. And I can keep doing that. I like to keep doing it till my graph runs out. Then I can draw a line up through there. The blue line, I'm going to start at -2. I'm going to go down 1 and over 2. Remember, if it's a negative slope, it's going to be going downhill. And we've learned to graph lines in another lesson. So we're going to remember that lesson. But we are going to notice that some lines are perpendicular because their slopes are opposite reciprocals, and some lines are parallel because they have the same slope. Have a great day.